So good afternoon, everyone. This is Amna bin Amara joining you from Tunisia for the time being. As Anna mentioned, I was supposed to be there in person, but due to some unexpected circumstances, I'm joining you online. Fortunately, when life gets unpredictable, technology can still save the day. So that's the good part of it. So today I'm joined by Peter Mousaferiadis to speak about how we find humanity in data. Before we proceed, I leave the floor to Peter to say a few words about himself.
Well, thank you very much, Amna bin Amara, and good evening, everyone. It's just after 9 p.m. here on Saturday night. I do have a rowdy household with children and visitors, so I do apologise if you can hear them coming through the wall. But where I'm presenting to you today from, it's often customary to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land, the Wurundjeri people. Before Europeans arrived in Australia, there were an estimated 700 ethno-linguistic people groups, more than 700 languages, speech communities, and speech variations. Today, only 50 of those traditional languages are spoken, and only 15 of those are spoken by young children. So the thought that I'm going to leave with you is, how would you feel if you were the last speaker of your mother tongue? On that note, I'm going to pass the floor back to Amna, and then I'll join you in about 10 minutes. Thank you.
We'll be asking so many questions, actually, Peter, throughout this presentation. So that's a good question to start with, actually. And while looking through the program of this conference, I noticed that several presentations actually focused on data-driven approaches to cultural diversity, with intriguing and interesting titles like, from data to impact or from data to inclusive leadership. Although I did not get the chance to attend those sessions, I believe that they align perfectly with what we'll be sharing with you today. But the difference is that probably this session will not be in the abstract. So while many advocate for data-driven inclusion or data-driven approaches to diversity, they often overlook actually the tools and the methodologies to actually measure and act on it. So that's what we'll be introducing today, a practical human-centered tool to measure cultural diversity in organizations. And the tool is Diversity Atlas. But before that, I will take you through a very short trip into the limits or the limitations of traditional DEI data. And we'll start with a very simple and brief scenario. Now, imagine joining a company where you don't see your culture or your identity reflected anywhere, like not in the policies, celebrations, or even leadership. Now, even if the numbers show diversity, you don't really feel it. You don't feel you belong. So this is a very discouraging indicator, isn't it? And that's actually one of the most serious weaknesses of traditional diversity, equity, and inclusion data. Now, another important question that can be raised in this context is whether we are truly valuing our people or the people within a particular organizational or workplace context, or are we just surveying or counting them? Because in many organizations today, DEI data tends to focus on what's easiest to measure, what's easiest to see. Things like gender, age, or ethnicity, which is a bit controversial, I admit. But these categories only scratch the surface and only tell one part of the story. They often miss the deeper aspects of identity, like language, belief systems, cultural heritage and ancestry, migration history, or even how people see the world or perceive the world around them. And when these layers go unrecognized, there will be a gap formed between what we measure and who people really are. Now, the result, of course, would be that many individuals will not feel represented. They will disengage. and they will begin to feel like, data points or checkpoints or checklists, and not valued as team members, and not valued for who they are. And that disconnection, of course, comes at a cost. And the cost here, of course, it can be trust, engagement, inclusion, and ultimately performance as well. So that's one thing that we should consider. But what we should also keep in mind is that the issue isn't just what data we collect. So as Anna mentioned, it's also how we collect it. Now, very often traditional DEI surveys tend to reduce the rich, multifaceted identities to a predefined checkboxes, as I mentioned. And when people can't express who they are, we don't just lose data, we also lose insights. But to be very clear, how we collect data reflects what we value. And if our tools are very rigid, outdated, or overly simplistic or reductionist, of course, they will risk excluding voices and reinforcing blind spots. But when data collection is thoughtful, inclusive, and equitable, it becomes a tool for visibility, belonging, and thus for positive change and long-term transformation and sustainability. So the real question now is, or should not be, whether we are, only hearing from everyone, but also whether we are asking the right questions and whether we are asking in the right way. So that's why we need to rethink the foundation of how we approach DEI data, because in the end, it's not only the numbers that matter, but the methods behind them and the extent to which these methods are reflective of the complexity and richness of the human experience. And this brings me to the next slide. So Peter, can you please move to the other slides? Yes, on what is data humanism. This brings me to a very interesting concept, which is data humanism. That's where the idea actually of finding humanity in data, it becomes so important. And I recently came across this concept. Actually, it was a few weeks ago. I came across a very interesting TEDx talk by Giorgia Lupi about the topic of data humanism, where she mentioned that data is not about numbers, it's about people. And what she means is that behind every data point, there is a story, or simply a lived experience. So instead of reducing people to percentages, data humanism asks different questions, including how can we use data to tell real stories and to reflect lived experiences. Now, for example, a bar chart or a staff diversity report might tell us that, for example, 30% of our team are women, but it doesn't tell us what age categories these women are, what cultural backgrounds do they have, and if those women are represented in leadership, or they are actually in leadership positions, or how these women feel about inclusion. Now, a humanized data approach goes a step further. And of course, by including stories, sentiment, and most importantly, context. And this gives us a very a deeper and more empathetic understanding of the people with whom we are, communicating, and the people surrounding us. Now, when we see data through this lens, it stops being about compliance or reporting, and it becomes more of a powerful way to listen, to understand, and to connect. So this is why we should not only be showing numbers, but also telling stories. And this brings me to the third slide, which is about the importance of telling stories and not just showing numbers. Thank you, Peter. Here we go. So, actually, one of Lupi's favorite examples in explaining her concept of data humanism is Charles Minard's famous 1869 map of uh, Napoleon's Russian campaign, which for her is not just data; it's a story. It shows the size of uh, Napoleon's army, shrinking over time. Also, the weather conditions and the path they took throughout the process. So you feel the weight actually of the losses, not just reading about them. And this where the strength of feelings and sentiments lie. Now, if we bring this example to the workplace or to workplace context, imagine, for example, an employee engagement report, that not only shows satisfaction scores, but also overlays it with turnover rates, let's say language fluency and average tenure. Now, suddenly we can see that it's not just a drop in morale chart, but it becomes more of a narrative, a story, a tale of an experience with different dimensions and different layers. So, this example shows that instead of treating data as purely objective numbers, it reminds us that data represents real people, real behaviors, and most importantly, real human experiences. Now, Lupai calls for a shift away from big mechanical, let's say, efficiency driven approaches towards this kind of small, meaningful, and human centered insight. And she often calls this data humanism approach as a manifesto. And her manifesto encourages us to value, as I mentioned, the complexity, the subjectivity, and the nuance in our data practices. Of course, this means going beyond speed and precision and instead asking what stories live behind the numbers. So focusing on the why and how questions. How do people feel about what this data reflects? And here I put feel in bold and I capitalize on it because this approach makes data more inclusive, more accessible, and most importantly, more useful for designing equitable strategies in the workplace. So based on what I said now, I will raise one final question, but I will not answer it. Instead, I'll let Peter do that. So, Peter, what can we do differently? How does Diversity Atlas manage to redefine what it means to be included? So thank
But
you.
thank you very
The
much.
floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Amna, for that introduction and your overview. I often say to people that if you want to be inclusive, you need inclusive data sets, sets that speak to the complexity of human identity. And I've been working in this area since 1988. It wasn't until 2014 when my CTO put to me, if I wanted to understand whether I was more or less diverse, how would I know that? And what does this concept of cultural diversity even mean? I was actually stopped in my tracks. Because if you wanted to develop a strategy for cultural diversity, what aspects of cultural diversity would you be referring to? So you would need to disaggregate that. So after 5 years and a literature review based on more than 300 articles and numerous books, and this has been an iterative process, we were able to disaggregate cultural diversity into the four areas that you see up the top. Country of birth going back 3 generations, and many of you have already taken the survey. So we use the UN database of full member states, non-member states, their dependent territories, and then we did extend that definition a little because we ran into some problems earlier on when we were deploying in some of the disputed territories along the world. And I won't have time today to go through the methodology of how we came up with that definition. But the next disaggregation was looking at languages. So we needed to have a database out there, and we built a database that speaks to the metrics of diversity, which I will speak to in a moment. And that database of languages includes speech communities and speech variations. So if you speak English, what type of English? We have 132 different types of English in our database. Then we realized the importance of secular and non-secular traditions. A friend of mine who heads up a multinational company, said to me, my identity as a Hindu is more important to me than my identity as a woman, more important than my gender. So why do we ignore some important aspects of identity? She went on to say to me, it informs what I eat, what I wear, how I approach every single encounter, how I make meaning and give expression to my daily life. The next disaggregation was asking questions around what ancestries people identify with, as well as what culture, and culture being a proxy for not only what cultures, you might be an American culture, but ethnicity and tribes. Then the beauty about Diversity Atlas, because we wanted to collect data. Data is basically anything that you can quantify. It's meaningless until you begin to categorize it. And when you categorize it, you create information. So what I'm trying to present here through this objective to become inclusive is the value of having data that speaks to all the aspects of identity. So here we can now start to intersect this concept of cultural diversity, this definition that we've developed, which is now being adopted across the world, intersected against gender expression, gender identity, biological sex, position type, position level is extremely important because it allows us to understand how equity may be playing out or not playing out at all, and a whole range of other attributes, including skin shade. Now, of course, I understand that some of these questions are sensitive in some areas of the world, so we can switch them on and off. Then the better part is you can now get a sense of how sentiment or experience intersects with identity. And I won't have time today to go into some use cases of how we work with companies. And now we can actually see how that experience may be intersecting with particular profiles, which can allow for greater interventions. And then this concept of mutuality, which I'm going to speak to in a moment. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about inclusion. Our last census in Australia, there were so many people who complained and said, well, you just make me feel like I don't exist, as you can see from the quote there. You make me feel like we have no meaning. You wash us up into these broad categories of white and black and brown, which start to flatten identity, erase ethnicity. And this quote that you can see here from a Kachin person, she comes from Myanmar. And in Myanmar, there's 110 languages and 135 ethnic groups, all with their own way of behaving, their social norms, their own cultural norms, and how they go about their daily lives. But this issue of lack of data exists everywhere. Even the European Commission, when it's trying to develop anti-racism action strategies, they're ineffective because they're not disaggregating the data by very important lines around cultural identity. But I want to speak to this next slide and the methodology we developed. I want to look at just language, for example. Let's say we had in one group 2 Italian and 2 Yoruba speakers from Nigeria. And in another group, we had an Italian, French, Portuguese, and Spanish, 4 Romance speakers. We have greater variety of languages in that second group. We can create an algorithm around that to highlight the absence of homogeneity. The next metric is disparity. What is the dissimilarity of those languages? And all of us here would understand that one's ethno-linguistic background shapes cognitive processes and gives expression and meaning to absolutely everything. If you haven't read the book, The Geography of Thought by Nisbet, I highly recommend it. So that second group of those Romance languages, now think of another group, which is Italian, Yoruba speaking, Mandarin, and Native American Cherokee. Where would the greater distance be? Obviously in the second group. Diversity in my culture just means one thing. It means difference. When we translate that word, and in many cultures, it means difference. In the West, we've overlaid it with all these socio-political connotations. The next metric looks at balance, which is what does that diversity look like? What does the distribution of those languages look like across an organization? Now, what's happened in Australia, they focused on diversity just through the lens of sexual orientation, gender, and ability. And that created a whole lot of unintended consequences. And I'll explain why, for an example. I used to sit on a committee where there used to be 10 men, 6 women. Now there's 8 men, 8 women, but I'm the only one of a non-English speaking background, when beforehand there were 6 of us. So we didn't take an intersectional lens. So we need tools, and this is why we developed Diversity Atlas. And mutuality is probably the most important. Mutuality speaks to what extent is an organization reflective of the community it's delivering products and services to. And we've done a lot of work in the health sector. And we've noticed that hospitals that had workforces that reflected the patients they were delivering healthcare to, those patients spend less time in hospital, there were better health outcomes, they save money on translations, on interpreters. Think of all the socio-cultural determinants of health, let alone the ethnopharmacological implications of health. I suffer from gout, and I take allopurinol medication every single day. But if you're a Han Chinese person or a Korean person, that medication doesn't work on you. Why? Because it wasn't tested on many ethno-linguistic people groups across the world. So I'm now going to come to the reveal. So thank you very much. And I'm sure you have so many questions to ask. But I just want to summarize by saying that we need foundational data, because when we have foundational data, we can make sure we're not compromising any of the subsequent stages of the DIKW model, the data, information, knowledge, and wisdom model. When you don't have inclusive data sets, survivorship bias gets the better of you, which basically means you are making decisions only on what you can see rather than what you can't see. Now, I'm going to hand the floor to Anna Zauno. Thank you, Anna, because I know you're going to do the reveal, and I know we're running out of time. So over to you, Anna. Thank you.